Welcome to this explainer. This is designed specifically as a high-level briefing for policymakers, so we are going to jump right into the deep end. Today, we're unpacking the complex historical and legal architecture of land rights. If we really want to understand rural land development and the urban housing crises happening all over the globe, getting a firm grip on this legal foundation, the jurisprudence of who gets to actually own land versus who's just allowed to exist on it, is absolutely paramount.
Okay, let's look at our agenda. We're going to cover access versus true ownership, the historical shift from feudalism to capitalist property, specific cultural barriers for women, modern threats to land, and then we'll wrap up with some concrete directives for policymakers.
Right, let's start with Section 1, access versus true ownership. This is the fundamental legal paradigm that really forms the basis of all rural land development.
So as policymakers, your core takeaway right off the bat is this critical legal distinction between access and ownership. Access just means having the ability to use the land economically, like farming a plot of dirt to feed your family. But there's a huge catch here. Mere access leaves individuals living under the constant threat of expulsion, entirely dependent on the whims of whoever actually owns the land. It severely limits financial stability. Ownership, on the other hand, represents inalienable rights. True ownership provides the absolute legal security you need to build capital, generate generational wealth, and actually secure your livelihood. Bottom line, without ownership, you just have permission, and permission can always be legally revoked. Let's formalize this with a definition. Land rights are the socially and legally enforced, inalienable ability of individuals to freely obtain, use, and possess land at their discretion. Now, this brilliantly highlights the crucial gap between the law on the books and the reality on the ground. You can legislate equality all day long, but true land rights only exist when those legal mandates are actually backed up by cultural tradition and social acceptance. If society doesn't enforce the right, the legal text itself is practically meaningless.
Moving on to Section 2, feudalism to capitalist property. To really grasp how these exclusive ownership rights function today, we've got to look backward and trace how they evolved from feudal customary systems.
It's really fascinating when you lay it out chronologically. Prior to the 16th century, society ran largely on feudal customary rights. Peasants had direct access to the land to sustain themselves. But then in the 16th century, the enclosure movement started kicking off in England. Landlords began asserting exclusive private property rights, literally fencing off common lands. Fast forward to the 18th century, and we see the total extinction of common use rights through formal parliamentary acts. This completely flipped the paradigm, ushering in the modern era. And legally, this era is characterized by a strict capitalist market dependence, because people are now forced to sell their labor since they no longer have direct, customary access to the land.
Thomas More captured the brutal reality of these enclosure movements with this incredibly striking phrase, "sheep devouring men." What he meant was that landlords were using their legal powers to crush peasant use rights, physically driving commoners off the land just so it could be used as pasture for highly lucrative sheep farming. It was a rapid and honestly often violent transition from communal village regulation right into competitive, market-driven agricultural leases. So the absolutely crucial point here is that capitalism was born not in the city, but in the countryside, through these shifting property relations. When direct producers were legally stripped of their customary land rights, they became utterly dependent on the market just to survive. This total legal transformation created a unique system of market dependence that forced both landlords and tenants to constantly maximize profit. And that systemic imperative? It's exactly what still regulates our social reproduction today.
Let's jump to Section 3, cultural barriers for women. We need to take this structural understanding of property law and apply it to the most vulnerable demographic in rural land development, women who are facing deep-seated patriarchal barriers. Now take a look at the stark contrast between the letter of the law and cultural reality. Over in India, the Hindu Succession Act of 2005 legally mandates equal inheritance for daughters and sons. But the actual reality? Patriarchal inheritance practices still overwhelmingly dominate, which frequently leaves women completely destitute if they don't have a husband. Then look at Uganda. Their 1995 constitution strictly enforces equality in land acquisition. Yet the deeply ingrained cultural habit is that land is still purchased and signed exclusively in the husband's name, while the wife just signs as a witness. Male lineage customs prevail. So the law provides theoretical access, but the culture is actively blocking true ownership. It's exactly as the scholar Bina Agrawal points out. Land ownership defines social status and political power in the household and in the village.
Think about it. When property is legally passed down solely through men, it automatically elevates them in the social hierarchy. Without legally recognized and socially accepted ownership, women fundamentally lack the political pull and the basic bargaining power they need to advocate for their own rights within their communities.
And the impacts of finally securing these legal rights for women are just staggering. The data clearly shows that when women actually own land, it significantly decreases the longevity of domestic violence, simply because they have an independent, safe shelter to escape to. It generates independent income. It even drastically lowers the risk of contracting HIV/AIDS, because these women don't have to resort to extreme measures for their basic survival. Securing these legal rights isn't just about textbook equity, it fundamentally alters the social fabric. It saves lives and elevates entire household dynamics.
Okay, moving to Section 4, Modern Threats to Land. We've traced the historical shifts and the cultural battles. But today, local communities aren't just fighting history. They are going head-to-head with unprecedented global market forces for the very space they live on.
Just take a second to process this number. 16 million. That is the number of vacant homes nationwide in the United States right now. To put that massive figure into perspective, there are 28 vacant units for every single unhoused person. This profound inefficiency is largely driven by wealthy investors acquiring properties and intentionally holding them empty.
We are witnessing what can only be described as a billionaire housing disruption. You've got roughly $6.2 trillion in total US billionaire wealth constantly looking for a safe place to park. So corporate landlords, like private equity giant Blackstone, are swooping in and buying up over 300,000 residential units. Throw in the massive expansion of the short-term rental market, which actively displaces locals to cater to transient tourism, and the picture gets pretty clear. We're seeing a hypergentrification where global wealth treats essential housing purely as a speculative commodity, rather than a place for actual human beings to live.
And hey, it's not just private equity either. Massive sovereign wealth funds are consistently allocating 10 to 12% of their immense, state-owned portfolios strictly to global commercial properties and real estate. This is a deliberate structural legal strategy. They are diversifying national wealth into tangible assets across the globe, meaning they are competing directly with local citizens for land.
When you look at the data, it shows that institutional capital views Western land, specifically in the US, the UK, and Germany, as the ultimate safe haven asset. Why? Because the legal property rights in these nations are absolutely ironclad. But when global institutions pour money into these specific regions, it drastically tightens the housing supply. It fundamentally warps the market, pricing out everyday citizens who are just looking for a place to live rather than a corporate investment vehicle.
And the result of all this? Luxury housing now functions as safety deposit boxes in the sky. The crucial takeaway here is that this globalized acquisition strategy effectively strips land of its core utility for human living. It is completely converting the fundamental human need for shelter into a highly financialized instrument designed for one thing: to protect and grow global wealth.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 5, Directives for Policymakers. Having diagnosed the historical roots of property law, the cultural barriers, and the modern financial crises surrounding land ownership, what actionable legal steps can you actually take today?
Here is a structured, action-oriented legal framework designed to fiercely shield local housing from those speculative markets. Step 1 requires strict corporate ownership transparency. We need to strip away the LLC shell game so communities know exactly who is buying up their neighborhoods. Step 2, institute first option to buy ordinances. This gives tenants the legal right to purchase their buildings or mobile home parks before they get sold off to global investors. Step 3, levy mansion taxes on luxury real estate transactions and intentionally vacant properties. And finally, Step 4, take that exact revenue and reinvest it directly into community-controlled social housing, like community land trusts. This actively returns the legal pathway of ownership right back to vulnerable communities.
So we'll leave you with this final thought. As you go out and draft the policies and jurisprudence of tomorrow, you really have to ask yourselves this fundamental question. Will future land laws protect the vulnerable community, or will they protect the global portfolio? The legal architecture you choose to build will determine the answer. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I hope this briefing empowers you to craft laws that truly serve the people.